The morning fog hung thick over the cobblestone streets of London as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic one final time. 23 years of service to the Crown had taught him that precision in appearance often meant the difference between life and death. His black boots gleamed despite the dampness, and his bearskin hat sat perfectly straight. As he took his position outside Buckingham Palace, Marcus had seen it all during his time as a Queen's Guard. Tourists who thought the guards were merely ceremonial decorations, protesters who believed they could breach the palace walls, and countless individuals who underestimated the training and dedication required to protect the royal family. What most people didn't know was that, beneath the traditional red uniform and stoic expression, lay a highly trained soldier with combat experience from 3 different conflicts. The sergeant had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious role of Royal Guard. His military record was spotless, decorated with commendations for bravery and tactical excellence. The selection process for the Queen's Guard was rigorous, requiring not only physical fitness and mental fortitude, but also the ability to remain completely motionless for hours while maintaining constant awareness of surroundings. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. Marcus had developed an almost supernatural sense for detecting trouble after years of military service. The usual flow of early morning pedestrians seemed normal enough, but there was an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite identify. His training had taught him to trust these instincts, even when logic suggested everything was fine. The palace grounds were bustling with the typical pre-ceremony preparations. Other guards were taking their positions at various posts around the perimeter, while palace staff hurried about their morning duties. The changing of the guard ceremony would begin in 2 hours, drawing hundreds of tourists and spectators. Security protocols were always heightened during these public events, but today felt different somehow. Marcus noticed a group of 3 men lingering near the main gates longer than usual. They weren't behaving like typical tourists who generally took photos and moved on quickly. Instead, they seemed to be studying the guard positions and timing the patrol rotations. His trained eye caught subtle details that civilians would miss. The way one man kept checking his watch, how another repeatedly glanced toward the rear entrance, and the third man's obvious attempt to conceal something bulky beneath his jacket. The sergeant's radio crackled softly with routine communications between the security teams. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but Marcus had learned to look beyond appearances. During his time in Afghanistan, he'd witnessed how quickly peaceful situations could turn deadly. The enemy often looked like ordinary civilians until the moment they revealed their true intentions. As the morning progressed, the 3 suspicious men were joined by 2 others. They spread out around the palace perimeter, maintaining visual contact with each other through subtle gestures and positioning. Marcus recognized the tactical formation immediately. It was a coordinated surveillance operation, possibly preparing for something much more serious. The weather began to clear as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full majesty of Buckingham Palace. The iconic building had stood as a symbol of British monarchy for centuries, surviving wars, political upheavals, and countless security threats. It was Marcus's sworn duty to ensure that tradition continued, regardless of the personal cost. Through his peripheral vision, Marcus observed one of the suspicious men moving closer to his position. The individual appeared to be in his 30s, average height and build, wearing dark clothing that could help him blend into crowds. What concerned the sergeant most was the man's apparent familiarity with the palace layout and security procedures. This wasn't a random troublemaker or confused tourist. This was someone who had done his homework. The morning shift change approached, and Marcus prepared to brief his replacement on the developing situation. However, protocol required him to maintain his position until the official handover ceremony. His radio remained active, allowing him to monitor communications between various security units throughout the palace complex. So far, no one else seemed to have noticed the coordinated surveillance operation taking place. Marcus's military training had emphasized the importance of patience and timing in dangerous situations. Premature action could escalate a minor threat into a major incident, while delayed response could allow threats to materialize into attacks. The key was recognizing the exact moment when observation needed to transition into action. The suspicious men had now been monitoring the palace for over an hour, far longer than any legitimate visitor would typically spend in the area. Their behavior patterns suggested they were gathering intelligence for a specific purpose, though their ultimate objective remained unclear. Marcus began mentally reviewing emergency response protocols while maintaining his stoic external appearance. Years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous adversaries often appeared completely ordinary until they revealed their true nature. The palace had faced numerous security challenges over the decades, from armed intruders to elaborate terrorist plots. Each incident had resulted in updated protocols and enhanced training for the guard units, but threats continued to evolve alongside security measures. As noon approached and tourist crowds began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony, Marcus realized the suspicious men were positioning themselves strategically around the palace perimeter. Their coordination was too precise to be coincidental, and their timing suggested they were planning something significant during the ceremonial event when security attention would be focused on crowd management. The sergeant's radio suddenly crackled with an urgent message from the Central Security Office. Intelligence services had received credible threats against the palace, and all units were to maintain heightened awareness while avoiding any obvious changes to routine operations. The message confirmed Marcus's growing suspicions about the men who had been conducting surveillance throughout the morning. What Marcus didn't know was that these men had spent months planning their operation, studying guard rotations, security procedures, and the layout of both the palace and surrounding streets. They had identified him as a key target due to his position and apparent seniority among the guard units. Their plan was about to move from surveillance to direct action, and Marcus would soon discover exactly what they were willing to do to achieve their objectives, though a stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Marcus had learned during his military career and his years of service as a royal guard. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus noticed the tourist crowds thinning unexpectedly near his position. While hundreds of visitors gathered at the main gates for the changing of the guard ceremony, the area immediately around his post had somehow become isolated. The 5 suspicious men had effectively created a buffer zone by positioning themselves strategically to discourage other tourists from approaching. Marcus maintained his rigid posture while his mind raced through possible scenarios. His military training had prepared him for ambushes, urban warfare, and close-quarters combat. But this situation presented unique challenges. As a royal guard, he couldn't abandon his post or break character without explicit authorization from his commanding officer. Yet the threat level was clearly escalating beyond normal security concerns. The man who had been observing Marcus most closely began walking directly toward him. Unlike typical tourists who approached guards to take selfies or ask questions, this individual moved with purpose and confidence. His gait suggested military training, and his eyes constantly scanned the surrounding area for potential witnesses or security personnel. As the man drew closer, Marcus could see the telltale signs of concealed weapons beneath his jacket. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize the subtle changes in clothing drape and body movement that indicated hidden firearms or knives. This wasn't someone looking to pose for photos or test the legendary stoicism of the Queen's Guard. This was a professional preparing for violence. The tourist crowds provided perfect cover for what was about to unfold. Hundreds of people were focused on the main ceremony area, while security personnel concentrated their attention on crowd control and VIP protection protocols. The timing was deliberate and sophisticated, suggesting months of planning and reconnaissance. Marcus's radio remained active, but the chatter focused on routine security updates and ceremony preparations. No one else had apparently recognized the coordinated threat developing around his position. He was essentially on his own, bound by protocol to maintain his post while facing what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated attack. The approaching man reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness. His eyes locked on Marcus's face. What he produced wasn't immediately visible to the sergeant, but the man's body language suggested he was now armed and ready to act. The other 4 men had moved into supporting positions, creating a tactical formation that would prevent Marcus from calling for help or attempting to retreat. In that moment, Marcus realized this wasn't a random crime or terrorist attack aimed at the palace itself. The precision and coordination suggested something far more personal and targeted. These men weren't trying to breach palace security or harm members of the royal family. They wanted something specific from him, and they had chosen this location specifically because of his role and responsibilities. The man with the concealed weapon spoke for the first time, his voice low but clearly audible despite the distant sounds of the ceremony preparation. His accent was difficult to place, possibly Eastern European or Middle Eastern, and his English was precise but carried the formality of someone for whom it wasn't a native language. "Sergeant Thompson," the man said, confirming that this was indeed a targeted operation rather than a crime of opportunity. "We know who you are and we know what you've done. We also know what you have access to and what you're going to help us obtain." Marcus's blood chilled as he realized these men had not only identified him personally, but had researched his background and current position. Royal guards were generally anonymous to the public, their individual identities protected for security reasons. The fact that these men knew his name and rank suggested either a significant intelligence operation or information provided by someone with inside access to palace security. The weapon became visible as the man adjusted his stance, a compact pistol held low against his body to avoid detection by distant security cameras or observers. The other four men had also assumed positions that suggested they were similarly armed and prepared for violence. Marcus found himself facing a coordinated armed assault in broad daylight. Surrounded by hundreds of innocent tourists, "You're going to do exactly what we tell you," the gunman continued, "or this situation becomes very unpleasant for everyone nearby. We know about your service record in Afghanistan, Sergeant. We know you've seen what happens when things go wrong in crowded places." The threat was clear and sophisticated. These men understood Marcus's military background and were using his combat experience against him. They knew he would be reluctant to engage in armed conflict surrounded by civilians, and they were exploiting his protective instincts to maintain control of the situation. Marcus's training had covered hostage situations and terrorist threats, but always from the perspective of someone with backup and tactical support. Here he was isolated and constrained by his ceremonial role. He couldn't draw a weapon without breaking cover, couldn't call for help without potentially triggering violence, and couldn't abandon his post without violating his sworn duty. The gunman stepped closer, now within arm's reach of Marcus's position. The weapon was pressed against the sergeant's ribs, hidden from view by the man's body and the angle of approach. To distant observers, it would appear to be nothing more than a tourist getting too close to a guard for a photograph. "We want the security codes for the East Wing service entrance," the gunman whispered. "We know you have access as part of your rotation duties. You're going to provide those codes and you're going to tell us the timing for the next shift change in that sector." Marcus's mind raced as he realized the true scope of the plot. These weren't random criminals or terrorists seeking to make a political statement. They were professionals conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation aimed at gaining access to specific areas of Buckingham Palace. The information they sought would compromise not just palace security, but potentially endanger members of the royal family. The weapon pressed harder against his ribs as the gunman grew impatient with Marcus's silence. Around them, the ceremony preparations continued as tourists chatted excitedly and security personnel focused on their assigned duties. The isolation created by the five conspirators was complete. Marcus was effectively trapped in plain sight of hundreds of witnesses who remained completely unaware of the drama unfolding. "You have 30 seconds to decide, Sergeant," the gunman hissed. "Cooperate and everyone goes home safely today. Refuse, and we start with the school children over there." He gestured slightly toward a group of young students who had gathered to watch the ceremony, their bright uniforms making them easily identifiable targets. The threat against civilians changed everything for Marcus. His military oath required him to protect innocent lives, even at the cost of his own safety or mission objectives. These men had clearly studied his psychological profile and understood exactly how to manipulate his sense of duty and honor. Marcus felt the cold steel of the gun barrel pressing deeper into his ribs as he weighed his impossible options. 23 years of military service had never prepared him for a moment quite like this, trapped between his duty to protect innocent lives and his sworn oath to safeguard the crown. The gunman's threat against the school children had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. 20 seconds. "Sergeant?" the gunman whispered, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Those codes, or we start teaching these tourists about real consequences. What the gunman didn't know was that Marcus's service record included more than just conventional military training. During his second tour in Afghanistan, he had been selected for specialized counterterrorism operations that required intimate knowledge of hostage rescue techniques and close-quarters combat. More importantly, he had learned to recognize the psychological tactics used by professional interrogators and kidnappers. The demand for security codes revealed several critical flaws in the conspirators' intelligence gathering. First, individual royal guards didn't have access to electronic security systems. Those codes were restricted to senior officers and specialized security personnel. Second, the East Wing service entrance had been permanently sealed 6 months ago following a security review. These men had based their operation on outdated information. Marcus realized he was dealing with competent but not exceptional adversaries. Their tactical positioning was solid, their timing was reasonable, and their research had been thorough enough to identify him personally. However, they had made the classic mistake of overestimating their intelligence and underestimating their target's capabilities. The sergeant's years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any hostage situation was the point when the captors realized their plan wasn't working as expected. These men had invested considerable time and resources in this operation, and they would likely become increasingly desperate and violent when they discovered their fundamental assumptions were wrong. "I need to explain something," Marcus said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice remained steady and controlled, designed to project calm authority despite the weapon pressed against his body. "The information you're looking for doesn't exist the way you think it does." The gunman's expression shifted slightly, revealing the first crack in his confident demeanor. His associates had noticed the extended conversation and were beginning to show signs of nervousness. Their formation remained tactically sound, but Marcus could see the subtle tells that indicated growing tension among the group. "You're lying," the gunman replied, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present before. "Our intelligence is solid. We know you have access to those systems as part of your rotation duties." Marcus recognized an opportunity to exploit the gunman's growing doubt while simultaneously protecting the civilians around them. His response would need to be carefully calibrated. Too aggressive and the situation could escalate to immediate violence. Too passive and the criminals might attempt to force compliance through threats against bystanders. "Your intelligence is 6 months out of date," Marcus said calmly. The East Wing service entrance was permanently sealed after the security review in May. The IE electronic access system was replaced with manual procedures that required two-person authorization from the Palace Guard Command. "I couldn't give you those codes even if I wanted to cooperate." The revelation hit the gunman like a physical blow. Marcus could see him processing the implications. Months of planning, significant financial investment, and considerable personal risk had been based on obsolete information. The psychological impact of realizing their operation was fundamentally flawed would make the criminals increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. One of the associates moved closer, apparently responding to a subtle signal from the gunman. The tactical formation was tightening, suggesting they were preparing to escalate their approach or attempt to extract themselves from the deteriorating situation. Marcus knew he had only moments before violence became inevitable. "That doesn't change anything," the gunman said, but his voice now carried the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed plan was collapsing. "You still have access to other areas. We'll modify our requirements." Marcus recognized the classic pattern of criminal behavior when primary objectives became unachievable. Rather than accepting failure and withdrawing, many perpetrators attempted to salvage something from their investment by pursuing secondary targets or modified goals. This tendency often led to increased violence and reduced tactical discipline. The school children, the gunman had threatened earlier, were now moving closer to their position as part of the general crowd migration toward the ceremony area. Their teacher was trying to maintain order while ensuring her students had a clear view of the proceedings. The proximity of innocent civilians added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. "Listen carefully," Marcus said, his training taking over as he recognized the need to de-escalate before the situation spiraled beyond control. I understand you've invested significant resources in this operation, but you're facing a fundamental problem that violence can't solve. The security changes were implemented specifically because of intelligence suggesting exactly this type of approach. The gunman's eyes narrowed as he processed this information. Marcus was essentially telling him that their operation had been anticipated and countered before it even began. The psychological implications were profound. Not only had their planning failed, but they might have been under surveillance from the beginning. "You're saying we were set up?" one of the associates asked, his voice carrying a note of panic that suggested the group's discipline was beginning to break down. Fear of capture often led to poor decision-making and increased aggression among criminals operating under pressure. Marcus realized he had inadvertently introduced a new variable into the equation. If the criminals believed they were facing a deliberate counterintelligence operation, rather than simply outdated information, their response might become even more violent and unpredictable. He needed to carefully manage their perceptions while maintaining his psychological advantage. "I'm saying the security procedures you're trying to exploit no longer exist," Marcus replied calmly. "Whether that's coincidence or design isn't my concern. My concern is ensuring that everyone in this area remains safe while this situation gets resolved." The weapon pressed against his ribs trembled slightly as the gunman's stress levels increased. Marcus recognized the physical signs of an individual whose carefully constructed plan was disintegrating in real time. Years of combat experience had taught him that desperate armed individuals represented the highest level of threat to civilian populations. Around them, the ceremony preparations continued with increasing intensity as the official changing of the guard approached. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He was facing the greatest threat of his career as a royal guard while surrounded by hundreds of tourists who had come specifically to witness the majesty and tradition of his service. The gunman's hand was beginning to shake as the reality of his situation became undeniable. Marcus could feel the weapon trembling against his ribs, a dangerous sign that the criminal was losing the emotional control necessary for rational decision-making. In Marcus's experience, armed individuals under extreme stress often made fatal mistakes that endangered everyone around them. "This isn't over," the gunman hissed through clenched teeth. "If we can't get what we came for, then maybe we need to send a different kind of message. Maybe the world needs to see what happens when the famous Queen's Guard isn't so untouchable after all." Marcus recognized the shift in criminal psychology immediately. When professional criminals realized their primary objective was unachievable, they often pivoted to symbolic targets or revenge scenarios. The gunman was no longer focused on obtaining security codes. He was now considering violence for its own sake, possibly as a way to salvage some perceived value from his failed operation. The other associates were showing increasing signs of nervousness as their carefully planned operation continued to deteriorate. One man kept glancing toward potential escape routes, while another seemed to be arguing silently with the leader about their next move. Marcus knew that group dynamics under pressure often led to splintered decision-making and increased unpredictability. What none of the criminals realized was that Marcus had been subtly positioning himself throughout the confrontation. While maintaining his ceremonial posture, he had made minute adjustments to his stance and hand placement that would allow him to respond immediately if violence became inevitable. His years of specialized training had included extensive practice in transitioning from static positions to combat readiness. The school children and their teacher had moved even closer, now positioned directly behind the group of criminals. Their innocent chatter and excitement about seeing the royal guards created a surreal contrast to the deadly serious confrontation taking place just meters away. The teacher had no idea that her students were in immediate danger from the men standing nearby. Marcus made a critical decision that would determine the outcome of the entire situation. Rather than continuing to wait passively for the criminals to escalate or retreat, he chose to take control of the encounter by revealing information that would fundamentally change their perception of the threat they were facing. "Before you do something irreversible," Marcus said quietly, "there's something you should understand about who you're dealing with. My name is Sergeant Marcus Thompson, and I didn't become a royal guard through ceremony and tradition alone." The gunman's eyes narrowed as Marcus continued speaking in the same calm, measured tone that had characterized his responses throughout the confrontation. There was something in the sergeant's voice now that hadn't been present before, a quiet confidence that suggested the balance of power was about to shift dramatically. I served with the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment before joining the Royal Guards, Marcus continued. 2 tours in Afghanistan, specialized in counter-terrorism and hostage rescue operations. I've been in situations like this before, but usually from the other perspective. The revelation hit the criminals like a physical blow. The Special Air Service was one of the world's most elite military units, renowned for their expertise in exactly the type of close-quarters combat and tactical operations these men were attempting. They had based their plan on confronting a ceremonial guard, not a highly trained Special Forces veteran. Marcus could see the fear beginning to replace confidence in the gunman's eyes as the implications became clear. The weapon was still pressed against his ribs, but the psychological dynamics had shifted fundamentally. The criminals were no longer dealing with a helpless target. Constrained by protocol, they were facing a professional warrior who had simply been waiting for the right moment to act. That doesn't change anything, the gunman said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. You're still outnumbered and you're still surrounded by civilians. One wrong move and people get hurt. Marcus smiled slightly, the first change in his facial expression since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the expression of someone who had faced death many times and had always emerged victorious. The criminals had made the classic mistake of assuming that ceremonial duties meant ceremonial capabilities. You're right about the civilians, Marcus acknowledged, which is why I've been waiting for the right moment to end this without anyone getting hurt. That moment is now approaching, and I want to give you the opportunity to walk away while you still can. The gunman's associates were beginning to show signs of serious doubt about their leader's judgment. They had signed up for what was supposed to be a carefully planned intelligence operation, not a confrontation with elite Special Forces personnel. Their body language suggested they were reconsidering their commitment to the mission. Marcus had learned during his military service that the most effective way to handle multiple armed opponents was to exploit divisions within their group while projecting overwhelming confidence in his own abilities. The revelation of his Special Forces background had already planted seeds of doubt. Now he needed to cultivate those doubts until the criminals' unity collapsed entirely. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations. In approximately 3 minutes, the ceremony will begin, and security personnel will conduct their standard crowd management sweep. When they do, they're going to notice 5 men positioned in a tactical formation around a royal guard. The truth of this statement was immediately apparent to anyone with basic understanding of security protocols. The criminals had been so focused on their target that they had failed to consider how obvious their positioning would become once security teams began their routine operations. At that point, Marcus continued, you'll have 2 choices. You can attempt to fight your way out against trained security personnel while surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, or you can walk away now and disappear into the crowd before anyone realizes what was happening here. One of the associates was already beginning to back away from the group, his nerve clearly broken by the combination of the failed operation and the revelation of Marcus's military background. The gunman noticed the defection and turned to confront his retreating colleague, momentarily taking his attention away from his primary target. Marcus recognized the opportunity immediately. 23 years of training and experience had prepared him for exactly this moment, when his opponent's focus wavered and a window opened for decisive action. The question was whether he should act now or continue trying to de-escalate the situation through psychological pressure. The decision was made for him when the retreating associate bumped into one of the school children, causing the young girl to stumble and cry out in alarm. The teacher immediately rushed to help her student, drawing attention from other nearby tourists and creating exactly the kind of commotion that would attract security attention. The gunman spun back toward Marcus, his face contorted with rage and desperation. The careful plan had completely collapsed, and he was now facing the choice between immediate surrender and a violent confrontation that he couldn't possibly win. In that moment, Marcus saw the decision forming in the criminal's eyes and knew that words were no longer sufficient to resolve the situation. The moment of truth arrived with lightning speed as the gunman's desperation reached its breaking point. Marcus saw the decision crystallize in his opponent's eyes. The criminal had chosen violence over surrender, gambling everything on one final desperate attempt to salvage something from his failed operation. "If I'm going down," the gunman snarled, pressing the weapon harder against Marcus's ribs, "I'm taking you with me. Let's see how legendary the CrownGuard really is." But Marcus had been preparing for this exact moment throughout the entire confrontation. His years of special forces training had taught him to recognize the precise instant when negotiation ended and combat began. As the gunman's finger moved toward the trigger, Marcus exploded into action with the fluid precision of a trained killer. The movement was too fast for untrained eyes to follow. Marcus's left hand swept upward in a defensive motion that deflected the gunman's weapon, while simultaneously striking his wrist with enough force to break bones. The gun discharged harmlessly into the air as the criminal's grip was shattered by the precisely targeted blow. In the same fluid motion, Marcus's right hand delivered a devastating strike to the gunman's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and doubling him over in agony. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, transforming the armed criminal from a deadly threat into a gasping, defenseless opponent. The gunshot had attracted immediate attention from security personnel throughout the palace complex. But Marcus wasn't finished with his opponents. The other 4 associates were reaching for their concealed weapons, apparently deciding to support their leader's desperate gambit despite the overwhelming tactical disadvantage they now faced. Marcus moved with the controlled violence that had made him legendary during his special forces career. He grabbed the stunned gunman and used him as a human shield while simultaneously drawing his own service weapon, a privilege granted to royal guards that most tourists never realized existed beneath the ceremonial uniform. "Armed police, drop your weapons immediately," Marcus commanded in a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of someone trained to control chaotic situations. The formal ceremony facade had disappeared completely, replaced by the tactical persona of an elite soldier responding to mortal danger. 2 of the associates froze immediately, their hands halfway to their concealed weapons as they recognized the hopelessness of their position. They had expected to face a ceremonial guard constrained by protocol and tradition, not a special forces veteran wielding a service weapon with obvious competence and deadly intent. The remaining 2 criminals made the fatal mistake of continuing their draw, apparently believing they could still fight their way out of the deteriorating situation. Marcus didn't hesitate. His training had taught him that hesitation in combat meant death, and he responded with the overwhelming force necessary to protect innocent civilians. The first criminal's weapon was barely clear of his jacket when Marcus's shot took him center mass, dropping him instantly. The second managed to raise his gun toward the crowd of schoolchildren before Marcus's second shot ended that threat permanently. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 seconds from the first gunshot to the final elimination of hostile targets. Palace security personnel arrived within moments, surrounding the area with weapons drawn and emergency medical teams close behind. The 2 surviving criminals surrendered immediately, their hands raised and their faces showing the shock of men who had vastly underestimated their opposition. The teacher was shepherding her students away from the scene, her training taking over as she created distance between the children and the aftermath of violence. Most of the tourists were still processing what had happened, their expectations of a peaceful ceremony shattered by the sudden eruption of gunfire and tactical response. Marcus maintained his weapon-ready position until senior security officers confirmed that all threats had been neutralized. Only then did he engage the safety and return to a more relaxed stance, though his eyes continued scanning for additional threats that might have been overlooked in the initial chaos. "Sergeant Thompson," called Chief Inspector Harrison as he approached the scene with a team of counterterrorism specialists. "What's your status report?" 5-man team attempted to extract classified security information through armed coercion, Marcus replied in the crisp, professional tone he had learned during years of military debriefings. 2 subjects neutralized, 2 in custody, 1 requiring immediate medical attention. The gunman was still conscious but clearly suffering from the injuries inflicted during Marcus's initial defensive response. Medical personnel were already working to stabilize him while maintaining the security protocols necessary for a high-value prisoner who might possess intelligence about additional threats. Chief Inspector Harrison nodded grimly as he surveyed the scene. Any indication this was part of a larger operation? Marcus holstered his weapon and resumed his ceremonial posture, though the transformation from warrior back to guardian was subtle and impressive to witness. They had detailed intelligence on palace security procedures, sir. Outdated information, but sophisticated enough to suggest significant planning and resources. I recommend a full counterintelligence investigation. The scene was rapidly being secured by specialized teams trained for exactly this type of incident. Evidence was being collected, witnesses were being interviewed, and the area was being swept for additional threats or explosive devices. The efficiency and coordination demonstrated why attacks on British royal properties were so rare and generally unsuccessful. What impressed the responding officers most was Marcus's complete transition back to his role as a royal guard. Despite having just engaged in lethal combat, he was already resuming his ceremonial duties while providing clear, concise briefings on the tactical situation. It was a demonstration of the extraordinary mental discipline required for his position. The two surviving criminals were being processed by counterterrorism specialists who would attempt to extract information about their organization, funding sources, and potential additional operations. The intelligence value of capturing operational members of a sophisticated criminal organization was enormous, and Marcus's restraint in not killing all 5 attackers would prove crucial for national security. As emergency medical teams worked on the wounded and crime scene investigators documented the evidence, Marcus found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed a routine morning into a life-or-death confrontation. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, but the reality of facing armed opponents while constrained by ceremonial duties had presented unique challenges. The school children and their teacher had been evacuated safely, and the tourist crowds were being managed by additional security personnel who had arrived to support the investigation. The changing of the guard ceremony had been canceled, but the palace remained secure and operational thanks to the rapid, professional response of Marcus and his colleagues. Chief Inspector Harrison approached Marcus again after completing his initial assessment of the scene. Outstanding work, Sergeant. Your actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach and saved civilian lives in the process. 3 weeks after the incident, Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace. But everything had changed. The morning newspapers carried headlines about the Royal Guard hero and the palace attack foiled, though the full details of the operation remained classified for national security reasons. The investigation had revealed the true scope of the threat Marcus had faced that Tuesday morning. The 5-man team had been part of a larger international criminal organization specializing in high-value intelligence theft. Their target wasn't actually the outdated security codes they had demanded, but rather Marcus himself. They had planned to kidnap a royal guard to extract information about palace security protocols and royal family protection procedures. Chief Inspector Harrison had briefed Marcus on the investigation's findings during a private meeting at Scotland Yard. The criminals had been under surveillance by MI5 for several months as part of a broader operation targeting organized crime groups with suspected terrorist connections. Marcus's successful defense of his position had not only prevented a serious security breach but had also provided crucial intelligence about the organization's capabilities and methods. The information we've extracted from the surviving subjects has led to arrests across 3 countries, Harrison had explained. Your actions that morning disrupted a network that had been planning operations against multiple high-value targets throughout Europe. The 2 criminals Marcus had been forced to kill had been identified as former military personnel from Eastern European Special Forces units who had turned to organized crime after their respective countries' political upheavals. Their sophisticated planning and tactical knowledge explained why they had been able to gather detailed intelligence about palace security procedures and identify Marcus as a specific target. The surviving gunman had eventually provided extensive cooperation with investigators. Apparently sobered by his encounter with Marcus's combat capabilities, and the realization that his organization had abandoned him after the operation's failure. His information had led to the dismantling of several criminal cells and the prevention of planned attacks on other protected locations. Marcus had been formally commended by both his military superiors and representatives of the royal family for his exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. The ceremony had been private, in keeping with the discreet traditions of the Royal Guard service, but the recognition from the highest levels of British government was unprecedented for an active duty guard. More importantly to Marcus, the school children and their teacher had all remained safe throughout the confrontation. He had received dozens of letters from the students, thanking him for protecting them and expressing their continued admiration for the Royal Guards. Their teacher had written a particularly moving letter, describing how Marcus's calm professionalism during the crisis had helped her maintain order and keep her students safe. The incident had also led to significant changes in palace security procedures. While the specific details remained classified, Marcus knew that his recommendations for enhanced threat assessment and response protocols had been implemented throughout the Royal Guard service. Future guards would benefit from additional training in recognizing and responding to sophisticated threats. Standing at his post 3 weeks later, Marcus reflected on the strange irony of his situation. He had joined the Royal Guard service seeking a peaceful conclusion to his military career, hoping to serve the crown in a ceremonial role that would allow him to put his combat experiences behind him. Instead, he had found himself drawing on every lesson learned during his Special Forces training to protect innocent lives and national security. The tourists who approached his position now seemed different somehow, or perhaps Marcus was simply more aware of the potential threats that could hide among innocent crowds. His training had always emphasized the importance of constant vigilance, but the recent experience had reinforced those lessons in ways that no exercise or simulation could match. The media attention had been both blessing and curse for Marcus and his family. While he appreciated the public recognition of the Royal Guard Service's dedication and professionalism, the spotlight made him uncomfortable and potentially compromised his effectiveness in future security operations. Plans were already in motion to rotate him to a different assignment within the palace complex. His wife Sarah had been both proud and terrified when she learned the full details of what had happened that Tuesday morning. She had always known that his military background might prove relevant to his duties as a royal guard, but she had hoped that his combat days were definitively behind him. The incident had reminded them both that service to the crown sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice. Marcus's fellow guards had treated him with a mixture of respect and good-natured ribbing about his newfound celebrity status. The brotherhood of military service was strong among the royal guards, many of whom had their own combat experience and understood the split-second decisions Marcus had been forced to make. Their support had been crucial during the stress of the investigation and media attention. The palace itself seemed unchanged by the drama that had unfolded on its doorstep, maintaining the timeless dignity and tradition that had made it a symbol of British stability for centuries. The changing of the guard ceremony continued daily, drawing thousands of tourists who came to witness the pageantry and tradition of the Royal Guard service. As Marcus stood at attention, watching the morning crowds begin to gather for the day's ceremony, he found himself thinking about the nature of service and sacrifice. His years in Afghanistan had taught him about protecting democracy and freedom in abstract terms, but his role as a Royal Guard had shown him the more personal side of duty, protecting individuals and families who represented centuries of British history and tradition. The 5 criminals had underestimated not just Marcus's individual capabilities, but the entire system of training, tradition, and dedication that created the Royal Guard service. They had seen ceremonial uniforms and formal protocols, and assumed they were dealing with theatrical performers rather than highly trained military personnel committed to protecting the crown with their lives. Marcus smiled slightly as he thought about the letters from the school children, particularly one young girl who had written that she now wanted to become a soldier when she grew up, so she could protect people like he had protected her class. Perhaps the most important outcome of the entire incident was the message it had sent about the values and capabilities of those who chose to serve their country. The morning sun climbed higher over London, burning away the fog and illuminating Buckingham Palace in golden light. Tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony, chatting excitedly about the traditions they were about to witness. Among them might be future threats or simply families seeking to share in the majesty of British heritage. Marcus maintained his vigilant watch, ready for whatever challenges might arise while serving as a guardian of the crown and protector of the innocent civilians who trusted in the security he and his fellow guards provided daily.